Welcome to our discussion about Walt Whitman, one of the most influential poets in American literature. So today we're going to be working through Song of Myself and Brooklyn Ferry. If you have the Norton Anthology, I'll be reading out of and working through this one. If you don't have it, I encourage you just to work out of or follow along with whatever version of Song of Myself and Brooklyn Ferry that you do have, okay? So if you have the Norton, again, it should look like that. We're going to begin on page 23. We're going to start with Song of Myself, and there are three themes in this text that I'd like you to kind of be aware of and notice throughout this. So the first theme is idea of self, which is sort of evident in the title, so idea of self. The second theme is identification of self with others. So you're going to see this with Whitman. There is sort of this idea that humanity is one big collective whole, and that we are all sharing in this similar experience, and we're all interconnected. And the third theme that you'll see in Song of Myself is the poet's relationship with nature. So sometimes people think of Whitman, they think of him as like the nature poet, but he does deal with his idea with nature. And much of this idea of nature and this connection to nature sort of comes from the Transcendentalist movement in the 19th century. So there is some debate on whether or not Whitman is sort of classified as a Transcendentalist. But Whitman was heavily influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who sort of began the whole Transcendentalist movement. So you also have Henry David Thoreau, who is in that movement as well. So many of his ideas, whether or not he technically is or is not a Transcendentalist, many of his ideas and thoughts and his topics come from the Transcendentalist movement. So I'd like for you to look at the first section of Song of Myself. So beginning on page 23, he starts off by saying, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, or you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. So again, this idea that we're talking all about myself or his self, he's talking about his self. And so he's not only just dealing with self, though, he's dealing with the idea of the collective whole of humanity. A couple of ideas or techniques that you'll see, and you can find this in the little author prezi or presentation. So some topics or writing styles that Whitman uses are parallelism, cataloging, and he also is sort of that person that we look at as the first person to use free verse. So in terms of parallelism, this is something that if you're familiar with the Bible and Hebrew poetry, you'll see in the book of Psalms. Quite often you'll have an idea that is stated, so you'll have one statement, and then the line below that will re-echo or reiterate that statement as well. So the very first line of this, I celebrate myself and sing myself. He's sort of doing this whole making a statement, I celebrate myself, and then he's following that statement up with a second statement which sort of expounds on that idea and reiterates that idea. So that's something you'll see throughout his work. Another example of that is about line 15 of the text, still on page 23, but line 15, section 2, if you're following along. He says, I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. So he's talking about the first line there is breathing the fragrance himself, but he also expounds on this idea at the line below this and talks about how this smell is just intoxicating. So that's an example of parallelism within the text. He also uses this technique called cataloging, which is when he takes various ideas and just lists them out. So sometimes cataloging will be referred to as listing. So an example of that here, page 25 of the text if you're following in the book. If not, section 4, a little before line 70. So he says, The latest dates, discoveries, inventions, societies, authors old and new, my dinner, dress, associates, looks, compliments, dues. Um, this is just a technique that recurs throughout Whitman's writing. He takes ideas and he lists those ideas out. So that's just cataloging or listing. So if you've ever heard that technique referred to with Whitman, that's what we're talking about. And then free verse basically means there is no necessary rhyme scheme within his text. He is as free as his subject matter. That is how his writing is, in a sense. Another example of parallelism is on page 26 of your text. Below 90, between lines 90 through 100, he says, "And I know the hand of God is the promise of my own, and I know the Spirit of God is the brother of my own, and that all the men ever born are also my brothers, and the women my sisters and lovers." So we are all related. That's sort of what Whitman is saying. There's this collective whole. Every atom that you have, we're all in this whole collective sea of humanity. He deals with nature throughout this. Section 6, he begins by even asking, or talking about a child asking what grass is. So what is grass? A child says, "Fetching it to me with full hands, how could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition out of hopeful green stuff woven." So again, Song of Myself is a rather extensive poem. You're getting just a sample of that in this class. Just some themes to keep in mind, again, of course, are idea of self, the collective whole, so identification of self with others, and Whitman's relationship with nature, okay? So let's skip to Brooklyn Ferry. All right, so Brooklyn Ferry begins in your text. In the Norton Anthology, it is on page 66, okay? And if you are following along, that's fine as well. I'll just list out the line numbers or any sections, okay? So again, we have this whole idea of a collective whole for humanity. So that's something that recurs throughout Whitman's writing. So section 1 of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, keep in mind here that the idea behind this poem, and this is again one of his most famous poems, a man is leaving work and he is crossing the ferry after work. And if you have ever been on a ferry, especially maybe if you took, or if you've ever been to New York and you've taken the Staten Island ferry, the ferry is just this really large boat where people are shuttled back and forth into New York or back to Staten Island. And it's just such an odd mixture of people. You see people from different backgrounds, different ages, different religions, different, political backgrounds. So this is something that he's noticing in the 19th century, and it's something that honestly you can go to New York and see that now. And I think it's kind of a really good example of, I guess, the universality of literature, because it shows that, even 100, 200 years ago, that's something that Whitman was noticing about the world, okay? So section 1 of the text, he's talking about all these people that he's surrounded by. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose, and you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me and more in my meditations than you shall suppose. So basically he's saying that we are this collective whole of humanity, and we have more meaning for each other than we even realize. That all these people that you pass, he's basically saying, or he has this opinion that we're all connected somehow, even more than perhaps that we suppose, okay? Page 67 of the text, section 3, about line 24, 23 or so. He says, just as you feel when you look on the river and sky, so I felt. So even looking back, he's like, just as you're looking at the river and the sky and how you're feeling this way about the river and all these thoughts going through your mind, I'm feeling the same way. And he says also, just as any of you is one of a living crowd, I was one of a crowd. So just because, as you were part of the crowd, I was also a part of the crowd as well. We also have an example of cataloging in this text as well, or listing. So page 69, you have the frivolous look, the adulterous wish, not wanting. I'm sorry, that's line 70, 75, 76, 77. He's talking about the cheating look, the frivolous word, the adulterous wish, not wanting, refusals, hates, postponements, meanness, laziness, none of these wanting. So really this is sort of this long observation of Whitman, or a man, as he is leaving work and observing all of those around him on the ferry. And keep in mind that Whitman was from New York originally. In section 9 of this, he's talking about the water, but he's also sort of talking about the sea of humanity as well. So page 70, before line 105, he's talking about the gorgeous clouds of the sunset, drenched with your splendor, me or the men and women generations after me. Cross from shore to shore, countless crowds of passengers. Stand up, tall mast of Manhattan. Stand up, beautiful hills of Brooklyn. And he follows all of this up and ends by saying, you furnish your parts towards eternity, great or small, you furnish your parts toward the soul, okay? So just keep in mind the techniques that Whitman uses and the overall ideas behind the text, and I hope that you explore some more poetry by Whitman. All right.